The shell exploded 20 yards from Private Thomas McLeod's muddy trench, showering him with fragments of Belgian earth and something far more grim. October 6, 1917 found the young soldier from Nova Scotia crouched in what had once been farmland but now resembled the surface of an alien world. The Third Battle of Ypres had been raging since July 31st, and the autumn rains had transformed the Flanders countryside into a hellish quagmire where men drowned in shell holes, filled with contaminated water. Mac Leod wiped the filth from his rifle with a trembling hand, his eyes scanning the desolate landscape that stretched toward the village of Passchendaele. The hamlet, barely visible through the perpetual mist and smoke, had become a symbol of everything this war represented: senseless destruction, unimaginable suffering, and the stubborn refusal of generals to acknowledge the futility of their grand strategies. The Canadian Corps had been called upon to accomplish what British and South African forces had failed to achieve after months of bloody assaults. General Arthur Currie, the Canadian commander, had protested vehemently against the operation, predicting it would cost 16,000 Canadian casualties for a piece of ground with no strategic value. His superiors had dismissed his concerns, and now for Canadian divisions prepared for what many suspected would be their final battle. Sergeant William Morrison crawled through the communication trench, his boots squelching through ankle-deep mud that clung like concrete. The veteran of Vimy Ridge had seen enough warfare to recognize the signs of impending disaster, but orders were orders. He gathered his section around him, their faces gaunt with exhaustion and the peculiar hollow-eyed look that came from witnessing too much death. "Listen up, lads," Morrison whispered, his voice barely audible above the constant rumble of artillery. "We're going over the top at dawn. The brass says Jerry's been softened up by the barrage, but we all know what that means." A few bitter chuckles echoed through the group. They had heard similar promises before Vimy, before Hill 70, before every assault that had cost them friends and brothers. The rain began again, adding to the misery of soldiers who had not been dry for weeks. Water dripped from the corrugated iron sheets that provided meager shelter, pooling in the bottom of trenches that had been carved from what was once productive farmland. The smell of death permeated everything: decomposing horses, unburied soldiers from previous attacks, and the sweet, sickly odor of gas that lingered in shell holes despite the constant wind. Lieutenant James Henderson, fresh from officer training in England, studied his waterlogged maps with growing despair. The carefully drawn lines bore no resemblance to the chaos that surrounded them. Roads had vanished beneath the mud, landmarks had been obliterated by months of shelling, and the very concept of front lines had become meaningless in this landscape of overlapping shell craters and flooded trenches. According to contemporary accounts, documented in the official history of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, the conditions at Passchendaele represented the absolute nadir of trench warfare. The combination of unprecedented artillery bombardment and the worst weather in living memory had created a battlefield that defied human comprehension. That as darkness fell on October 6th, the Canadian soldiers prepared for an assault that would test their courage, their endurance, and their loyalty to comrades who had already paid the ultimate price. The village of Passchendaele lay before them like a fever dream, its ruins barely visible through the perpetual gloom that had settled over the Flanders plain. Dawn broke grey and merciless over the Flanders battlefield on October 12, 1917. The Canadian Corps had spent 6 days preparing for this moment, but no amount of planning could have prepared them for the reality of advancing across ground that had been churned into an impassable morass by 3 months of continuous shelling. Private McLeod crouched in the jumping-off trench, his rifle clutched with white-knuckled intensity. Beside him, his friend Private David Campbell from Prince Edward Island checked his ammunition for the 10th time, a nervous habit that had kept him alive through previous battles. The preparatory bombardment had been thundering for hours, but instead of the usual sense of confidence it should have inspired, the men felt only dread. At precisely 6 a.m., the whistles shrieked along the line. Lieutenant Henderson raised his arm, then brought it down in a sharp motion. "Over the top, boys, for Canada." The words were immediately swallowed by the cacophony of battle as 4,000 Canadian soldiers climbed out of their trenches and began their advance toward the German positions. The first 100 yards were the worst. The artillery barrage had failed to cut the German wire, and worse, it had turned the already saturated ground into a porridge of mud, water, and human remains. Men immediately began disappearing into shell holes filled with liquid mud, their screams cut short as they sank beneath the surface. Those who tried to rescue them often suffered the same fate, pulled down by the weight of their equipment and the suction of the bottomless mire. Sergeant Morrison led his section in a zigzag pattern, trying to find solid ground that might support their advance. Machine gun fire from camouflaged German positions raked across their front, but the mud proved to be as deadly as enemy bullets. He watched in horror as Private Johnson, a farm boy from Saskatchewan, stepped into what appeared to be a puddle and vanished completely, his rifle floating momentarily on the surface before it disappeared. The German defenders, members of the 4th Army under Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, had prepared their positions with methodical precision. They had learned from previous Canadian attacks particularly the stunning success at Vimy Ridge, and had developed new defensive tactics specifically designed to counter Canadian assault methods. Machine gun nests were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire, while artillery observers called down accurate barrages on any group of advancing soldiers. Captain Robert Mackenzie, commanding a company of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, found himself cut off from his men within minutes of the attack beginning. The carefully rehearsed assault plan had disintegrated in the face of impassable terrain and fierce German resistance. He could see muzzle flashes from enemy positions that were not marked on any of his maps. Evidence of the thorough German preparations. The Canadian advance had been planned as a methodical progression in waves, with each phase carefully timed to coincide with the lifting of the artillery barrage. But the reality was chaos. Men became separated from their units, officers lost contact with their soldiers, and the entire attack devolved into small groups of soldiers fighting individual battles against an enemy they could rarely see. Private Campbell found himself alone in a shell crater, sharing the space with two wounded Germans who were too badly injured to pose any threat. One of them, a boy who could not have been more than 18, kept calling for his mother in a weak voice that barely carried over the sound of battle. Campbell, despite his training and his hatred for the enemy, found himself sharing his water with the wounded German, recognizing in the boy's eyes the same terror that he felt in his own heart. The advance continued through the morning, measured not in yards gained but in lives lost. Each shell hole became a small fortress, each strand of uncut wire a monument to Canadian courage. The soldiers pressed forward not because they believed in the objectives set by their commanders, but because they could not abandon their comrades, who had already paid such a terrible price. By noon, the Canadian Corps had advanced approximately 200 yards at a cost that would not be fully calculated until days later. The village of Passchendaele remained as distant and unattainable as ever, its ruins shimmering through the mist like a mirage in the desert of mud and death that stretched endlessly before them. The afternoon of October 12th brought no respite from the horror that had engulfed the Canadian Corps. As the survivors of the morning assault regrouped in whatever shelter they could find, the true scope of the disaster began to emerge. Entire platoons had vanished into the mud, their fate unknown and unknowable. Communication lines had been severed by the constant shelling, leaving battalion commanders to make critical decisions based on fragmentary reports and desperate assumptions. Private McLeod found himself in a shell crater with 7 other survivors from his company, including Sergeant Morrison, who had taken shrapnel in his left arm but refused to leave his men. The crater, originally created by a German artillery shell weeks earlier, had filled with rainwater and worse things. The men crouched on its slippery edges, taking turns to peer over the rim and search for signs of their missing comrades. There, Morrison pointed with his good arm toward a group of figures moving through the murk about 50 yards away. Could be our boys, or could be Jerry. Can't tell in this bloody mess. The constant rain and drifting smoke from burning equipment made identification nearly impossible at any distance greater than a few yards. The sound of someone crying for help echoed across the battlefield, but it was impossible to determine the direction or distance. Private Campbell, who had made it back to the crater after his encounter with the wounded Germans, volunteered to investigate. Could be one of ours, he said, checking his rifle. Can't just leave him. Lieutenant Henderson, who had also found refuge in the crater, made the decision that would define his character for the rest of his life. I'll go with you, Campbell. Morrison, you're in command here. If we're not back in an hour, assume we're not coming back. The two men slipped over the crater's edge and disappeared into the maze of mud and destruction that had once been Belgian farmland. The German defensive positions had been constructed with typical efficiency, taking advantage of every natural feature that remained after months of bombardment. Machine gun nests were positioned in reinforced concrete pillboxes, virtually immune to artillery fire and perfectly positioned to command the approaches to Passchendaele. The defenders had learned to work in small, independent groups, maintaining communication through a network of deep bunkers that had survived the Canadian bombardment. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, a veteran of the Eastern Front, watched the Canadian advance through his periscope with professional admiration. These were not the same British soldiers who had attacked so futilely for months. The Canadians moved with purpose and skill, adapting quickly to the impossible conditions and continuing their advance despite casualties that would have broken lesser units. As documented in the German Fourth Army's operational reports, their commanders had developed specific respect for Canadian fighting abilities following the Battle of Vimy Ridge. Special defensive measures had been implemented specifically to counter Canadian assault tactics, including the placement of additional machine gun positions and the pre-registration of artillery targets on likely Canadian assembly areas. Henderson and Campbell found the source of the crying in a flooded shell hole about 30 yards from their original position. Private Williams, a signaller from Ontario, had fallen into the crater and broken his leg. Worse, the water level was rising steadily, and Williams was too weak to climb out on his own. The two men worked frantically to construct a makeshift stretcher from abandoned equipment, knowing that every moment they delayed increased the risk of being spotted by German observers. The rescue operation required all their ingenuity and courage. Campbell lowered himself into the flooded crater while Henderson provided security. His rifle trained on the German positions that seemed to loom through the mist like malevolent spirits. The water was chest-deep and contaminated with everything that war could produce: fuel, blood, human waste, and the decomposing remains of soldiers from both sides. Williams was barely conscious, his lips blue with cold and his eyes unfocused. With pain, Campbell managed to fashion a rope from equipment straps and passed it around the wounded man's chest. But lifting him out of the crater required strength that the mud seemed determined to sap from their bodies. Henderson abandoned his security position and joined the rescue effort, and together they managed to pull Williams to safety. The journey back to their shell crater took nearly 2 hours, as they were forced to take cover repeatedly from German, Petrosian random artillery fire. Williams drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally muttering about his home in Thunder Bay and the girl he had left behind. By the time they reached the relative safety of their original position, all 3 men were exhausted beyond measure. Sergeant Morrison looked at the rescued soldier with grim satisfaction. "Good work, lads. That's what we do. We don't leave our own behind." The simple statement carried the weight of a philosophy that had sustained the Canadian Corps through its darkest hours, a commitment to comradeship that transcended the madness of the battlefield. As darkness fell on October 12th, the Canadian positions were consolidating for the night, knowing that the morning would bring renewed attempts to advance toward the elusive village of Passchendaele. October 15th dawned with a peculiar stillness that veteran soldiers recognized as the calm before renewed storm. The Canadian Corps had spent 3 days consolidating their gains, tending to their wounded, and preparing for the next phase of the assault. The costs had been staggering: entire battalions reduced to company strength, companies reduced to platoons, and platoons reduced to scattered groups of survivors who held their positions through sheer determination. Private McLeod had been promoted to lance corporal, not through any desire for advancement but because so many of his superiors had fallen. The responsibility weighed heavily on his shoulders as he studied the faces of the men under his command. Most were replacements, fresh-faced boys from training camps in England who had never experienced the reality of trench warfare. Their clean uniforms and nervous energy stood in stark contrast to the mud-caked veterans who had survived the previous assaults. The village of Passchendaele remained tantalizingly close, its church spire visible through the morning mist as a reminder of the objective that had already cost so many lives. Intelligence reports suggested that the German defenders were as exhausted and demoralized as the attackers, but previous intelligence had proven unreliable, and the men had learned to trust only what they could see with their own eyes. Lieutenant Henderson, now commanding what remained of his company, received orders that filled him with dread. The assault would resume at dawn on October 16th, with the objective of capturing the village and establishing a defensive line on the ridge. Beyond, the orders were precise and detailed, but they bore no relationship to the reality of the battlefield, where every yard of advance required superhuman effort and extraordinary sacrifice. Sergeant Morrison had returned to duty despite his wounded arm, his presence providing a stabilizing influence on the newer soldiers who looked to him for guidance. He had fought at 2nd Ypres, Vimy Ridge, and Hill 70, battles that had established the Canadian Corps' reputation for military excellence. But Passchendaele was different here. Courage and skill seemed insufficient against the combined enemies of weather, terrain, and German determination. The German defensive positions had been reinforced during the brief lull in fighting. Crown Prince Ruprecht had personally visited the front lines, bringing with him additional artillery and fresh troops from the reserves. The German High Command recognized that losing Passchendaele would represent a significant psychological victory for the Allies, potentially undermining German morale at a critical point in the war. As recorded in the memoirs of General Erich von Falkenhayn, the German strategy relied on making every Allied advance so costly that eventual victory would be meaningless. The defenders at Passchendaele had been instructed to exact the maximum price for every yard of ground, turning the battlefield into a killing ground that would consume Allied manpower faster than it could be replaced. The Canadian preliminary bombardment began at 3 a.m. on October 16th, a thunderous barrage that could be heard in England. The shells fell on German positions with mathematical precision, but the defenders had learned to shelter in deep bunkers that could withstand all but direct hits. When the barrage lifted at dawn, the Germans emerged from their shelters to find their wire intact and their machine guns ready for action. Private Campbell, now serving as a runner between companies, carried the attack order through the communication trenches. The message was simple and direct: advance at all costs, establish a foothold in the village, and hold the position regardless of casualties. The stark simplicity of the orders reflected the desperation of commanders who had run out of tactical innovations and could only rely on the raw courage of their soldiers. The assault began with the same precision that had characterized previous Canadian attacks, but the conditions had deteriorated even further. The constant rain had turned the battlefield into a landscape that defied description. Where the distinction between land and water had ceased to exist, men advanced through a world of liquid mud, their progress measured in inches rather than yards. McLeod led his section forward, following a compass bearing toward objectives that existed only on maps. The village of Passchendaele had been so thoroughly destroyed that individual buildings were indistinguishable from shell craters. The men advanced by instinct and determination, guided by the faint outline of the church spire that somehow continued to stand. Despite months of bombardment, the German resistance was fierce and immediate. Machine gun fire swept across the Canadian advance, but the attackers had learned to move in small groups, using every fragment of cover to minimize their casualties. The battle became a series of individual confrontations, soldier against soldier, each fighting for survival in a world that had abandoned all pretense of civilization. By noon, elements of the Canadian Corps had reached the outskirts of Passchendaele, but at a cost that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The village they had fought so hard to capture was nothing more than a collection of brick dust and broken timber, its value measured only in the blood that had been spilled to possess it. The dawn of November 6, 1917, brought with it a sense of grim determination that pervaded the Canadian positions around Passchendaele. After months of brutal fighting, the village lay within reach, but the cost of capturing it had already exceeded General Currie's most pessimistic predictions. The Canadian Corps had been bled white in the Flanders mud, yet the soldiers prepared for what they hoped would be the final assault. Lance Corporal MacLeod stood in what had once been the cellar of a Belgian farmhouse, now serving as a command post for the remnants of his company. The walls were lined with wounded soldiers waiting for evacuation, their faces bearing the 1,000-yard stare that had become common among survivors of the Passchendaele campaign. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault on men who had not been dry for weeks. The plan for the final assault was ambitious in its simplicity. The Canadian Corps would advance on a broad front, with the objective of capturing the village and establishing a defensive line on the ridge beyond. 3 Canadian divisions would participate. The 3rd Canadian Division would attack from the south, the 4th Canadian Division from the southwest, and the 1st Canadian Division would provide support and exploit any breakthrough. Lieutenant Henderson, now commanding the shattered remains of what had once been a full company, studied his orders with the weary professionalism of a man who had seen too much war. The objectives were clearly marked on his map, but the reality of the battlefield bore little resemblance to the neat lines drawn by staff officers in comfortable headquarters. The village of Passchendaele existed more as a concept than as a physical location. Its buildings reduced to rubble and its streets transformed into interconnected shell craters. The German defenders had prepared for this moment with characteristic thoroughness. The Fourth Army had constructed a network of mutually supporting strongpoints, each designed to extract maximum casualties from any attacking force. Machine gun nests were positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire, while mortar positions were pre-registered on likely Canadian assembly areas. The defenders knew that this battle would determine the fate of their positions in the Ypres salient. Sergeant Morrison, his wounded arm now barely functional, gathered his surviving men around him for what they all suspected might be their final briefing. The faces that looked back at him were a mixture of veterans who had survived previous assaults and replacements who had arrived only days before. The newcomers still possessed the eager enthusiasm of men who had not yet experienced the reality of modern warfare, while the veterans displayed the hollow-eyed exhaustion of soldiers who had witnessed too much death. Listen carefully, Morrison began, his voice hoarse from weeks of shouting orders over the din of battle. We've been given the honor of taking this bloody village, and by God, we're going to take it. We've come too far and lost too many good men to fail now. We go over the top at 6 a.m., and we don't stop until we're drinking German beer in what's left of their trenches. The preparatory bombardment began at 4 a.m., a thunderous barrage that represented the concentrated firepower of the entire Canadian Corps' artillery. The shells fell on German positions with devastating accuracy, but the defenders had learned to shelter in deep bunkers that could withstand all but direct hits. The Canadian gunners, working in conditions that would have been considered impossible in peacetime, maintained their barrage with mechanical precision, despite the mud that clogged their equipment and the rain that made accurate observation nearly impossible. As documented in the official war diary of the Canadian Corps, the final assault on Passchendaele represented the culmination of months of tactical evolution. The Canadian forces had adapted their methods to the unique challenges of the Flanders battlefield, developing new techniques for advancing through mud, coordinating artillery support in impossible conditions, and maintaining unit cohesion in the face of devastating casualties. At precisely 6 a.m., the Canadian assault began with the precision that had become their trademark. The advancing soldiers moved in small groups, each team assigned specific objectives and trained to operate independently when communication with higher command became impossible. The men had learned to read the battlefield like a book, interpreting the smallest changes in terrain and adjusting their tactics accordingly. Private Campbell, now serving as a section leader due to casualties among the NCOs, led his men forward through the maze of shell craters and abandoned equipment that marked the approach to Passchendaele. The village church spire, somehow still standing despite months of bombardment, served as their guide through the featureless landscape of mud and destruction. The German resistance was immediate and fierce, but different from previous encounters. The defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew that defeat would mean the collapse of their entire defensive position. Machine gun fire swept across the Canadian advance, but the attackers had learned to move with the patience of experienced hunters, using every fragment of cover to minimize casualties while maintaining their forward momentum. By noon, lead elements of the Canadian Corps had fought their way into the outskirts of Passchendaele, but the village they had sacrificed so much to capture bore no resemblance to the peaceful farming community it had been before the war. The buildings had been reduced to brick dust and twisted metal. The streets had disappeared beneath shell craters, and the only recognizable landmark was the damaged church spire that continued to stand as a monument to human endurance. The morning of November 10, 1917, brought an eerie silence to the battlefield that had consumed so many lives. The Canadian Corps had achieved their objective. The village of Passchendaele was in Allied hands, and the survivors were establishing defensive positions on the ridge beyond. But victory had come at a price that would haunt the Canadian nation for generations to come. Lance Corporal MacLeod sat in what had once been the main street of Passchendaele, surrounded by the ruins of a civilization that had existed for centuries before being obliterated in the space of a few months. The village that had cost 6,000 Canadian casualties to capture was nothing more than a collection of brick dust and shattered timber. Its value measured only in the symbolic importance that military planners had assigned to its possession. The final assault had succeeded, through the same combination of courage, skill, and determination that had characterized Canadian operations throughout the war. The 3rd Canadian Division, led by Major General Louis Lipset, had captured the village itself, while the 4th Canadian Division, under Major General David Watson, had secured the approaches from the west. The 1st Canadian Division, commanded by Major General Archibald MacDonald, had provided crucial support and consolidated the gains. Lieutenant Henderson, now the senior surviving officer of his battalion, walked through the ruins with the pace of a man conducting an inventory of destruction. Every building had been reduced to rubble, every tree had been shattered into splinters, and every sign of human habitation had been erased by months of continuous bombardment. The village church, its spire still standing despite everything that had been thrown at it, served as the only landmark in a landscape that had been transformed beyond recognition. The German withdrawal had been conducted with typical efficiency, but the defending forces had exacted a terrible price for every yard of ground. The Canadian Corps had advanced less than 5 miles in 4 months of fighting, but those 5 miles had cost more casualties than any other operation in Canadian military history. The survivors moved through the captured positions with the stunned disbelief of men who had somehow lived through an experience that defied human comprehension. Sergeant Morrison, his wounded arm now in a makeshift sling, supervised the establishment of defensive positions among the ruins. The Germans had constructed their trenches with engineering precision, but the Canadian soldiers had learned to improve upon enemy techniques through hard-won experience. The new positions were designed to withstand the inevitable counterattacks that would come as soon as the Germans recovered from their withdrawal. The cost of victory was becoming clear as casualty reports reached Canadian headquarters. The Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry had been reduced to less than company strength. The Royal Canadian Regiment had lost 70% of its men, and similar losses had been suffered by units throughout the corps. The flower of Canadian manhood lay buried in the Flanders mud, their sacrifice marked only by wooden crosses that would soon be washed away by the relentless rain. Private Campbell, one of the few survivors from his original company, wrote a letter to his family in Prince Edward Island, struggling to find words that could convey the reality of what they had experienced. The letter, preserved in the Canadian War Museum archives, captures the mixture of pride and horror that characterized the Canadian reaction to their victory at Passchendaele. That is recorded in the personal diary of General Arthur Currie. The Canadian Corps commander felt a profound sense of responsibility for the casualties suffered during the campaign. His pre-battle prediction of 16,000 Canadian losses had proven tragically accurate, but the strategic value of the captured ground remained questionable. The village of Passchendaele would be abandoned by Allied forces within 5 months. As the German spring offensive of 1918 forced a general withdrawal from the Ypres salient, the German defenders, members of elite units from the 4th Army, had fought with skill and determination that earned the respect of their Canadian opponents. The withdrawal had been conducted in good order, with the defending forces maintaining their cohesion despite the collapse of their defensive positions. The German casualties had been significant, but not on the scale of the losses suffered by the attacking Canadian forces. The battlefield itself bore testimony to the intensity of the fighting that had raged for months. Shell craters overlapped shell craters in an endless pattern of destruction, while the remains of men and equipment were scattered across a landscape that would remain scarred for decades. The very ground had been poisoned by the chemicals of war, creating a wasteland that would resist all attempts at cultivation for years to come. As the Canadian soldiers consolidated their positions in the ruins of Passchendaele, they could not have known that their victory would come to symbolize both the heroism and the futility of the Great War. The village they had fought so hard to capture would be remembered not for its strategic importance, but for the courage of the men who had died to possess it and the determination of those who had survived to tell their story. The first snowfall of winter 1917 began on November 15th, covering the battlefield of Passchendaele with a merciful blanket of white that concealed the horrors beneath. The Canadian Corps had completed their consolidation of the captured positions, but the cost of victory continued to reverberate through the ranks of survivors who struggled to comprehend the magnitude of their losses. Lance Corporal MacLeod, now acting company sergeant major, due to the catastrophic casualties among the NCOs, stood in the ruins of Passchendaele Church and attempted to compose a letter to the parents of Private Williams, the signaller they had rescued weeks earlier, but who had died of his wounds in a casualty clearing station behind the lines. The words seemed inadequate to convey the courage their son had displayed or the respect he had earned from his comrades. The strategic situation had stabilized with the capture of Passchendaele, but both sides recognized that the cost of the campaign had been disproportionate to the gains achieved. The German High Command, sobered by the ferocity of the Canadian assault, had already begun planning new defensive positions further east. The Allied commanders meanwhile struggled to justify casualties that had exceeded even their most pessimistic projections. Lieutenant Henderson, now commanding a composite battalion formed from the survivors of multiple units, walked through the Canadian positions with a mixture of pride and profound sadness. The men under his command represented the best of Canadian military tradition, but their ranks had been so thinned by casualties that entire companies consisted of barely enough men to form a platoon. The cheerful optimism that had characterized the Canadian Corps at the beginning of the war had been replaced by the grim professionalism of veterans who had seen too much death. The village of Passchendaele, for which so much blood had been spilled, existed now only as a symbol. The physical reality was nothing more than brick dust and twisted metal, but the idea of Passchendaele had become something larger than its material form. The Canadian soldiers who occupied its ruins understood that they had participated in something that would be remembered long after the tactical details had been forgotten. Sergeant Morrison, his wounded arm healing slowly in the cold weather, supervised the training of replacement soldiers who arrived daily from England. The new men were eager and well-trained, but they lacked the hard-won experience that had allowed the original Canadian Corps to achieve its victories. The process of integrating these replacements into veteran units required patience and skill, as the survival of the entire unit depended on the rapid development of combat effectiveness. The German forces, now positioned in new defensive lines several miles to the east, had not abandoned their respect for Canadian fighting abilities. Intelligence reports captured during the final assault revealed that German commanders had specifically identified Canadian units as priority targets for their artillery and had developed special tactics designed to counter Canadian assault methods. The reputation of the Canadian Corps had been purchased with blood, but it was a currency that both sides understood and respected. The weather continued to deteriorate as winter deepened, but the Canadian soldiers had learned to adapt to conditions that would have been considered impossible in peacetime. The techniques developed during the Passchendaele campaign, methods for maintaining equipment in extreme conditions, tactics for fighting in mud, and systems for evacuating wounded across impassable terrain, would influence Canadian military doctrine for decades to come. Private Campbell, now a corporal leading a section of mainly replacement soldiers, found himself becoming a repository of institutional memory. The new men looked to him for guidance not just in tactics and techniques, but in understanding the spirit that had carried the Canadian Corps through its darkest hours. The stories he told around the small fires that provided their only warmth, who became part of the oral tradition that would preserve the memory of Passchendaele long after the official histories had been written. The casualty lists continued to arrive at Canadian headquarters, each one containing names that represented not just military statistics but the destruction of entire communities. Small towns across Canada had lost their entire young male population, while families waited for news that would never come. The human cost of Passchendaele extended far beyond the battlefield, reaching into every corner of Canadian society. As 1917 drew to a close, the Canadian Corps began preparing for the campaigns that would come with the spring. The lessons learned at Passchendaele, the importance of thorough preparation, the value of tactical flexibility, and the necessity of maintaining unit cohesion under extreme conditions would be applied to future operations. The survivors of the campaign carried with them not just the memory of their fallen comrades, but the knowledge that Canadian soldiers could accomplish the impossible when properly led and adequately supported. The village of Passchendaele would be abandoned by Allied forces in March 1918. As the German spring offensive forced a general withdrawal from the Ypres salient, the ground for which so many Canadians had died would be given up without a fight, its strategic value having evaporated with changing circumstances. But the reputation of the Canadian Corps, forged in the mud and blood of Flanders, would endure long after the tactical situation had changed. The men who had fought at Passchendaele had established a tradition of military excellence that would inspire future generations of Canadian soldiers and serve as a testament to the courage of ordinary men faced with extraordinary circumstances. The battle was over, but its legacy would live forever in the collective memory of a nation that had paid the ultimate price to prove its worth on the world stage.